Hi, welcome back to this channel. Should you not listen to the fourth chapter of this book, Lies from the Time of the Revolutions, I would suggest you to listen to it first. You can find the video in my playlist. Without further ado, shall we start? Let's enjoy yourself with the History's Greatest Lies by William Weir. Chapter 5, Lies from the American Wild West. Jesse James and members of his gang, including his brother Frank, are seen hiding out in the woods in Missouri. Many believe the notorious bandit and 19th-century Robin Hood was nothing more than a cold-blooded killer. The James brothers in Missouri, Wyeth, Newell Converse Chapter 9 Jesse James, American Robin Hood or serial murderer. BUSDS of steam spat from T-train's valves as IT pulled to a stop in Centralia, Missouri, on the morning of September 27, 1864. A small contingent of men on horseback approached the locomotive, excited but cautious. A man in his mid-twenties wearing a cavalryman's hat atop his head of wavy, shoulder-length brown hair stood out from the rest. Clearly, he was the leader. His men deferentially pulled their horses back from the train as he approached, waiting to hear his command. The leader briefly trotted his horse up the train line, looking through the windows at the frightened faces inside as he decided what to do next. When the train arrived, he and his 80 or so followers, guerrilla soldiers fighting for the Confederate cause, had been in the midst of sacking the small town, a bastion, they believed, of Union sympathizers. Not unlike a scene from a Wild West movie, the group had descended upon Centralia out of the blue, firing their guns in the air as they raced through the town center, robbing people at gunpoint in their own houses, looting stores and homes, and horsewhipping anyone within reach. Any Centralia citizen who read the newspaper headlines would have immediately identified the carnival of violence as the work of William Bloody Bill Anderson and his crew. Anderson's nickname was well earned. The previous year, he had ridden with Quantrill's Raiders, the most famous and feared of all Confederate guerrilla forces in Missouri, and he had taken part in the slaughter of about 200 men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas. Anderson, by all reports, was the most gleeful killer of Jesse James, Wright, and his brother Frank posed for the camera in 1870. Together, they served in the Civil War in the notorious Confederate guerrilla force of Bloody Bill Anderson. After the war, they began robbing banks and trains. Frank decided to end his criminal career after a botched job that netted all of $23 and ended in the deaths of 2 gang members. Frank and Jesse James C. 1870, American photographer. Jesse James was an American version of Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Reality Jesse James was a Confederate vigilante who killed and stole without mercy, giving nothing back to the poor. All the raiders, and he single-handedly murdered more Lawrence residents than any of his comrades. As Bloody Bill sized up the situation, a lanky 16-year-old member of his gang with sandy hair and piercing blue eyes steadied his horse, one hand on the reins. Brand new to the war, Jesse James gripped a revolver tightly in his other hand. His brother Frank, 4 years his senior, was nearby. Frank, like Anderson, had been a member of Quantrill's Raiders, but he had been injured in a battle and sent home to recover. By the time Frank's wound healed, Anderson had broken from Quantrill to form his own group. By then, Jesse and Frank's mother, Zerelda, had decided Jesse was old enough for war and sent her 2 boys out to fight for the Confederate cause in which she strongly believed. They immediately joined up with Anderson. When Bloody Bill found out that a large group of Union soldiers traveling home on furlough were on the train, he made his decision. He moved his men to their car and ordered the soldiers to step off the train, where he made them line up and take off their uniforms. He spent the next few minutes waxing poetic on how he expected no quarter in this war and in turn would give none, and how for honor's sake he would not let any captured enemy soldier live. "Every Federal soldier I put my finger on," Anderson announced, "will die like a dog." He told his guerrillas to ready their weapons. A split second of crackling rolling gunfire was the last sound the unarmed Union soldiers would ever hear. In a moment, each of the approximately 25 lay dead next to the train tracks. Young Jesse James would earn a reputation in Anderson's band as a dedicated and disciplined fighter. Unlike many other inexperienced soldiers in the guerrilla contingent, James would patiently hold his trigger until the perfect moment during an ambush and fearlessly charge straight at the enemy during a frontal assault. Until now, though, he had probably not killed anyone in cold blood. If he had killed anyone, it was an armed soldier, and it was during a battle. What James contributed to at the Centralia train depot was mass murder. Far from being repulsed by what was patently a war crime, James was unfazed, perhaps even exhilarated. In fact, in the short time he spent with Anderson, he came to view him as a war hero and leader. When Anderson was killed soon after Centralia hunted down and shot dead by Union Major Samuel Cox of Gallatin, Missouri James vowed to avenge the murder of his hero. The MWH of the noble outlaw American popular culture often portrays Jesse James as the epitome of the good, bad guy. In addition to numerous songs and internet fan sites, the robber and murderer from Missouri has been featured in at least 50 Hollywood movies and made into an action figure for children. He has at least one annual festival named after him, complete with barbecue, fire truck rides, and chainsaw carving demonstrations. James even made an appearance on the sitcom The Brady Bunch, which, incredibly, offers one of the more accurate depictions of Jesse James as a violent, homicidal fanatic who killed innocent, unarmed people without remorse. The more popular perception of James as a Robin Hood-type figure appears in writings such as cowboy songs and other frontier ballads. The 1910 book that launched author John Lomax's career, thanks largely to a foreword by Theodore Roosevelt. In it, Roosevelt alluded to one of the most famous folk songs of its time, the Ballad of Jesse James. The song depicts the most famous bandit who ever lived as a generous, good-natured man who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, and who was treacherously shot in the back by a dirty little coward who had ate of Jesse's bread and slept in Jesse's bed. Roosevelt couldn't help but see the parallel with Robin Hood and wrote, "There is something very curious in the reproduction here on this new continent of essentially the conditions of ballad growth which obtained in medieval England. Including, by the way, sympathy for the outlaw, Jesse James taking the place of Robin Hood. A testament to the power of incomplete information, misunderstood facts, and historical unawareness, Roosevelt's commentary has been misinterpreted by Jesse James fans over the past century." Writers and bloggers on the subject like to say that Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed Jesse James the American Robin Hood, implying that he was a fan of the legendary outlaw. It's doubtful that Roosevelt, a former police commissioner in New York City, would have glorified a cold-blooded killer like Jesse James. Indeed, his statement does no such thing. Roosevelt proclaims nothing. He simply made an observation of fact. American ballad writers viewed Jesse as Robin Hood's counterpart. Bushwhackers versus Jayhawkers. Jesse James came into the world at the perfect time and in the ideal place to forge a career as the most famous outlaw of his time. He was born in 1847 to Robert and Zerelda James in Clay County, Missouri, which had become a slave state under the Missouri Compromise. When Jesse was 7 years old, however, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, overturning the 1820 Missouri Compromise and opening up the possibility for Missouri and Kansas to outlaw slavery by popular vote. More than 3/4 of Missouri's population was pro-slavery, but the less settled Kansas Territory was up for grabs. The territories soon descended into violent struggles between the two sides. As abolitionist settlers from the eastern states descended upon Kansas and Missouri en masse to swing the vote their way, slavery supporters earned their nickname Bushwhackers by raiding abolitionist settlements, with anti-slavery Jayhawkers responding in kind. In 1855, John Brown conducted his bloody raid in Kansas, murdering 5 pro-slavery settlers, after which the two sides entered into a minor terror-style war, 10 years before the Civil War broke out. The James family, which owned 7 slaves, lived in the middle of it all. Clay County was only 1 county away from the Missouri-Kansas border, with the relatively heavily populated Kansas City just to its south. Jesse's father Robert, a Baptist preacher, had left the home in 1850 to spread the word in the gold mining camps, and he died of cholera within 3 months. Their mother, Zerelda, remarried twice, was an unapologetically vocal supporter for the Confederate cause. That, combined with her oldest son's bushwhacking exploits, put the James farm in the sights of Union intelligence gatherers during the Civil War. On more than one occasion, Union sympathizers harassed the family. Once, in the summer of 1863, a group of local Union militiamen, not Union troops, but Federalist supporting citizens who had formed their own group, much as Quantrill and Anderson had done, arrived on the farm looking for information on the whereabouts of the Confederate raiders. Jesse and a slave were tending to the tobacco crops when the militiamen suddenly appeared. They grabbed Jesse by the scruff of the neck and dragged him across the field to the house. Zerelda characteristically approached them head-on, shouting obscenities at her hated neighbors turned enemies. Ignoring Zerelda and her man-sized bravado, they focused their attention on the more timid half of the couple, Zerelda's third husband, Reuben Samuels. The militiamen had come prepared. They took out a noose, put it around Samuel's neck, and pulled it tight, threatening to hang him if he didn't provide information. Samuels pleaded ignorance to every question they shouted at him. Their patience at an end, the militiamen threw the other end of the rope around a tree branch and pulled Samuels off the ground. They let their kicking, choking victim down before he was strangled to death, but Samuels suffered a permanent injury to his throat. Jesse could only sit and watch this brutality with horror and hatred. Applying the lessons of Bloody Bill, Jesse James had entered the war a committed Confederate. By 1865, he was a fanatic. His loathing for the Union had been potent during the war and was fired up afterward by the same thing that infuriated most rebels: Reconstruction, which, among other acts perceived as injustices, disenfranchised former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers from the political process. After the war, the boy nicknamed Dingus quickly displayed the leadership qualities and temperament of a world-class outlaw. As a veteran of Bill Anderson's legendary Marauders, he commanded immediate respect. Anderson's group was known by Confederate sympathizers as an elite group of warriors, and anyone who served with them was known as a special brand of soldier. Still seething over their defeat in the war and their perception that the Union was treating ex-Confederates unfairly, many bushwhackers turned to crime. These are Southern belle with attitude matriarch of the James clan. Zerelda Samuel was married 3 times and raised her boys to fight against the Union, enthusiastically sending Jesse out to join Confederate raiders when he was 16 years old. Seemingly inspired more by her hatred for the North than love of the South, Zerelda was a fierce advocate for the Confederacy. Missourians who vocalized an opposing view were summarily treated to one of the woman's famous tongue lashings. Mrs. Samuel, mother of Frank and Jesse James, American photographer, whatever authoritative void the death of Jesse's father, Robert James, might have left in his children's lives, his wife, Zerelda James, more than made up for. Nearly 6 feet tall and possessing a powerful temper that could frighten even her friends, Zerelda was staunchly political and backed the pro-slavery movement with fierce intensity. No dainty Southern belle, she applauded the bushwhackers' border raids and every murder they committed, and she would give a tongue lashing to anyone who didn't agree with her. Anger and self-righteousness don't pay the bills, though. With no source of income after her husband's death, Zerelda was on the verge of losing the farm. She quickly married a wealthy farmer twice her age, Benjamin Sims. At the age of 52, however, Sims had no interest in raising Jesse, Frank, and their younger sister, Susan. He and Zerelda separated and soon afterward, he died. In less than 2 years, Zerelda was married again. The third time was a charm. Dr. Reuben Samuels was 3 years younger than her and was more interested in her children than Sims had been. He took legal guardianship over the children, gave up his physician practice, and moved to Zerelda's house to become a farmer, all seemingly under the orders of Zerelda. Near the end of the war, her collaboration with Confederate guerrillas was so well known that she came to the attention of top Union brass in the area. In January 1865, Union officials issued Order No. 9, which required the departure of the James clan, along with 10 other local families, from Missouri within 20 days. Zerelda, Reuben, and Susan packed up and were moved to southern Nebraska. Eventually, she would come back to Missouri. After Jesse's death, Zerelda spread a small bed of river stones on the ground beneath his tombstone. She invited sightseers to take a stone with them as a memento for 25 cents apiece. When the stone supply ran thin, Zerelda would go down to the river and collect more. Men never accepted the end of the war. Missouri was perhaps the most ravaged state in the war, and the political scene was hot as ever. Unless a man could prove that he had not served in the Confederacy, he would be summarily barred from holding public office, voting, and even preaching in a church. 3/4 of Missouri's men were removed from public life and left powerless. As a result, the radical Republicans took over the government and eventually gave civil rights to all former slaves. With no Union army left to fight, bushwhackers focused their fury on banks and train, symbols of creeping industrialism and Yankee encroachment. Every dollar stolen, every train derailed was a victory. And if a former Union soldier or Republican politician were murdered in the process, so much the better. Of course, the riches gained tens of thousands of dollars on occasion was surely the main draw, a fact almost always ignored by writers and movie-makers enamored with antebellum-minded bandits. Jesse and Frank James quickly established names for themselves in the burgeoning new industry of bank and train holdups. Many historians credit them with inventing the daylight bank robbery in Liberty, Missouri, situated in Clay County, where the James boys lived. On February 13, 1866, a group of men on horses entered town. 2 of them walked into the bank, and one approached the counter to request change for a $10 bill. As one of the 2 cashiers stepped up to the counter, the man put a revolver in his face and demanded all the cash in the bank. The cashier complied. After being handed nearly $60,000, the robbers forced the 2 men into the vault and shut the door. Assuming the door would automatically lock, they ran out of the bank and mounted their horses. The employees pushed the unlocked door open and shouted into the street that the bank had just been robbed. One of the riders, panicking, turned and shot and killed a 19-year-old boy who happened to be standing near the bank. It was the first known bank robbery of its kind, and a reward was immediately posted for the bandits. Many believe that Jesse and Frank were the perpetrators. The pair lived only a few miles from the bank, and other known bushwhackers were spotted near the scene firing their guns as they fled. Tification but retracted it when his life was threatened. Nevertheless, no hard evidence linked them to the robbery. Murder and revenge in Gallatin. The first crime unquestionably committed by Jesse James occurred on December 7, 1869, in Gallatin, Missouri. Shortly after noon, Jesse and a partner entered the Daviess County Savings Association. As the perpetrator did in Liberty, Jesse asked to cash in a banknote, this time worth $100. The cashier, a local Democratic leader named John Sheets, sat down at his desk to fill out a receipt. Jesse eyed the bankman carefully. He silently pulled out his revolver and drew a bead on him. A deafening blast resounded throughout the small building. Sheets must have felt as if he were hit by a truck. Before Sheets had time to realize he had been shot in the chest, Jesse put a bullet in his head. The killer grabbed a folder from a desk, and the two criminals fled. As they began galloping out of town, Jesse's horse reared, and he fell from the saddle. His foot got caught in the stirrup, and he was ingloriously dragged for 50 feet before freeing himself. At this point, Gallatin citizens had rallied and were on the heels of the two bandits. Jesse quickly mounted his partner's horse, and the two escaped from the town center. Within about a mile, the robbers were relieved to see a lone man riding his horse. Jesse James wasted no time pulling out his gun and making it clear that the horse was going with him. The rider, of course, submitted to the request. For all that trouble, the haul amounted to little or nothing in cash. But stealing money possibly wasn't why Jesse had ridden to the Daviess County Bank in the first place. Jesse was likely there to avenge the death of his hero, Bloody Bill Anderson. Anderson's killer, Samuel Cox, had returned to his hometown after the war, and Jesse by all accounts knew it. And, tragically, Sheets happened to bear a close resemblance to Cox. Whether or not Jesse pointedly sought out Cox or just mistook Sheets for Cox when he entered the bank, he was fully convinced that he had killed his sworn enemy in cold blood, telling everyone who would listen afterward that he had avenged the death of the great bushwhacker. Jesse James was a warrior to the core, but the stories of his being a good bad guy are exaggerations of true tales or complete fabrications. It is true that a 19th century lithograph depicts William "Bloody Bill" Anderson. In Centralia, Missouri, he ordered the execution of more than 20 unarmed Union soldiers captured on their way home on furlough. His boasts of offering no quarter to the enemy made many think of him more as a homicidal maniac than a soldier. Young Jesse James, however, looked up to Anderson and arguably considered him a father figure. Bloody Bill Anderson, American School, Jesse James, American Robin Hood or serial murderer. He didn't rob banks only for the money, that he most likely felt passionately that his deeds were as political in nature as they were profitable, and that he is known to have robbed train passengers only twice during his many train robberies. But his goal certainly wasn't to share his newly gained wealth with the poor. Jesse was, in essence, fighting an old war, at a time when most other former Confederates were moving on with their lives. Jesse was bold, for sure, but he was also angry and impetuous, a dangerous combination that is not mentioned in any known ballads. Contemporary myth-making. On the afternoon of September 26, 1872, three men approached the ticket gate at the Kansas City Exposition where a large crowd of attendees was exiting. One of the men strutted up to the window and grabbed a tin box filled with approximately $1,000. The shocked ticket taker reached out and attempted to take it back. A slight scuffle ensued, but when one of the men fired his revolver, the ticket taker backed off. The crowd froze, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and the trio made a quick getaway on their horses. The James brothers are usually credited with the audacious robbery. However, a few historians question their involvement, emphasizing a lack of hard evidence proving such. Whether or not Jesse and Frank were the actual perpetrators, the robbery secured them a place in frontier mythology. Kansas City Times editor John Newman Edwards was particularly taken with the brazen act. Although he had known about Jesse James and his exploits, this was the robbery that inspired Edwards to begin a body of writing dedicated to heaping praise on the former Confederate guerrilla and contributing more than any other writer to the myth of Jesse James. Originally from Virginia, Edwards himself had served in the Confederacy, fighting Union troops in Texas and, like Jesse and his comrades, refused to surrender when the war ended. Rather than lay down their weapons, he and his comrades crossed the border into Mexico, where the unit's commander, General Joe Shelby, attempted to hire his unit out in the fight between Waristas and the French, but to no avail. 164 in 1866, the Confederates decided life in the Union was preferable to Mexico, and they trudged back north. Eventually landing a job at the Kansas newspaper, Edwards decided to promote the South's cause with his pen. By all signs, he was better at soldiering than writing, but his influence on building Jesse James up into a folk hero is inarguable. After the Kansas City Exposition raid, Edwards penned an article entitled "The Most Desperate and Daring Robbery of the Age," in which he praises his hero's cold-blooded nerve and stupendously daring villainy, and claimed the robbery surpass anything in the criminal history of this country, at least if it does not overtop the exploits of Claude Duval or Jack Sheppard. Later, in a piece called "The Chivalry of Crime," Edwards wrote, "These are not bad citizens, but they are bad because they live out of their time. The 19th century is not the social soil for men who might have sat with Arthur at the Round Table, ridden at tourney with Launcelot. What they did we condemn. But the way they did it we cannot help admiring. It was as though 3 bandits had come to us from the storied Odenwald and shown us how the things were done that poets sing of." The obsession of the Confederate aristocracy with all things medieval is well documented, even by 19th century standards, though Edwards' prose is over the top. Yet his readers loved it, buying completely into the sanitized and romanticized version of medieval Europe transported to the American frontier. And Jesse James himself was one of Edwards' biggest fans. He began leaving letters at the scenes of his crimes, seemingly aware that they would somehow land up in the hands of Edwards or another supporter in the press. In them, Jesse would rail against Yankee corruption and portray himself as a stout fighter for the poor and oppressed. In one letter, he actually claimed to rob from the rich and give to the poor. In another, he compared himself to Napoleon and Alexander the Great. 165 Edwards later claimed to have conducted a lengthy personal interview with Jesse James, in which the bandit again stated his innocence in certain crimes. Jesse presented detailed evidence expunging himself of robberies, train heists, and murders, dared his enemies to confront him, and painted himself as a victim of conspiracies and Yankee animosity. The interview is at best a purple patch exaggeration of a real conversation or a complete fabrication on the part of Edwards. End of the road in 1877, Jesse James and his gang decided to strike the Union where they believed it would hurt most in the North. They settled on the town of Northfield, Minnesota, most likely because it was the hometown of former carpetbag governor of Mississippi, Adelbert Ames, who had served in the Civil War under Union General Benjamin Butler, a man particularly despised by Southerners for his draconian security measures in New Orleans. The now wealthy Ames later married Butler's daughter and, it was believed, kept his fortune deposited in the town's bank. The James gang rode for days to reach their destination, a huge effort for what began as a sadly conceived objective and ended up a resounding fiasco. Late in the morning of September 7th, the James brothers and 3 members of their gang rode into Northfield. Over breakfast of ham and eggs in a tavern, they discussed politics and tried to bet the tavern owner that the Democrats would win the next election. They left the restaurant, took a quick look around the town, split up into 2 groups, and rode out of town. At about 2 p.m., the group of 5 rendezvoused near the bank in town. 2 stayed with the horses outside while the 3 others, including Jesse and Frank, entered the bank. Jesse pulled out his gun, approached the counter, and demanded cash. Within moments, word of the robbery spread from the bank to the streets. Chaos ensued. Outside, Northfield citizens began shooting at the 2 strangers outside the bank. Others, who carried no weapons, threw rocks at them. Inside, the robbers argued with the bank employees. Waving their guns menacingly, the James brothers and their partner screamed at the bankmen to open the safe. The safe, though, was on a time lock and could not be opened. The robbers threatened to kill everyone in the bank if the safe weren't opened. At some point, a Swedish immigrant named Nicholas Gustafsson, who didn't speak English and was understandably confused, was told to get out the way. When he didn't move, he was shot in the head. With bullets flying in the street, the robbers abandoned the idea of gaining access to the safe. They grabbed any money lying within sight and left the bank to make their getaway. On their way out, one of them, believed to have been Jesse, put his gun to the head of cashier Joseph Haywood and pulled the trigger, killing him instantly. In the gunfight outside, 2 members of the James gang were killed. Jesse, Frank, and 4 other gang members escaped. They made off with $26.70, or $4.45 each. In the gunfight outside, 2 members of the James gang were killed. Jesse, Frank, and 4 other gang members escaped. They made off with $26.70, or $4.45 each. To Frank James, Northfield marked the beginning of the end of his career. He soon became exhausted from living on the run and moved east with his family, eventually earning a living as a livestock importer. He was arrested, arraigned, and/or tried for various crimes between the years 1882 and 1884, beating the rap every time. Jesse, though, wouldn't give up the ghost. After the departure of Frank, He went to work forming a new crew and hatched new schemes to lash out at his old enemy, the Union, and make a lot of money while doing it. But by this time, it just wasn't the same. There were a number of bounties on Jesse's head, and even those who made a hero out of him in the 70s began considering him more of a problem than an asset. Reconstruction had ended, and most ex-Confederate soldiers and Southern sympathizers had begun adapting to life in the Union. Even John Newman Edwards stopped answering Jesse's correspondences. Other than penning his erstwhile hero's obituary in 1882, Edwards was done with him. Murdered by a dirty little coward, Jesse James sat in the parlor of his new home in St. Joseph, Missouri, with 2 new members of his gang. It was April 3, 1882, and almost all the others had been arrested or killed. A number of bounties had been offered for the capture of Jesse over the years, but recently the governor of Missouri himself issued a $10,000 reward, and now Jesse was worried. With the state itself officially turning against him, it finally began to dawn on Jesse that he had been living in the past. Clearly, there was little room in the future of the United States for a gun-toting Confederate outlaw. As the 3 men discussed the details of a new robbery they were planning, Jesse looked up at a picture on the wall. Noticing that it was covered with dust or perhaps cobwebs, he stood up to brush it clean. He turned his back to his new partners, Charles Ford, who had taken part in Jesse's last train robbery, and Charles's 20-year-old brother Robert, an inexperienced but eager handler of the now much diminished gang. As the brothers watched Jesse cleaning the picture, Robert quietly drew his gun. Jesse's last action in his brief but exciting life was uncharacteristically domestic. Robert pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through the back of Jesse's head. The loud crack of Robert's gun was punctuated by the thud of the outlaw's body hitting the floor. In all, Jesse James is believed to have taken part in 26 robberies of banks and trains, netting more than $260,000 by very conservative estimates, and killing at least 10 people, including a Pinkerton detective investigating the James brothers, innocent bystanders, and bank and train employees. The majority of victims were unarmed. His assassination is called a betrayal by the Jesse James mythmakers, but what exactly Ford owed Jesse is never mentioned. Sure, he was living in Jesse's house, but they were there to plan another robbery. In a time when horses were the quickest modes of transportation, it wasn't uncommon to have long-term guests. Robert Ford, a young member of Jesse James' gang in its waning days, shot his leader in the back on April 3, 1882. He is portrayed as a coward in the many folk songs glorifying James, and parallels between Ford and Judas are not uncommon. The mythmakers, however, always neglect to mention the numerous unarmed people James killed in cold blood. Bob Ford, American photographer, Jesse James, and Robert Ford were partners in crime, and their relationship was one of convenience. Jesse and his gang members weren't friends in the traditional sense of the word. In fact, Jesse had murdered a member of his own gang, Ed Miller. As rewards for his capture began piling up, Jesse was becoming more and more paranoid of getting caught, and he believed Miller was going to contact the authorities to collect the reward. They argued about it, and Jesse killed Miller in an ensuing duel. In another moment of extreme suspicion, Jesse had asked certain members of the gang to kill Jim Cummins, another member of whom Jesse was suspicious. They refused, but Cummins disappeared soon afterward, probably murdered by Jesse. Rarely is Ford's name mentioned in popular history without the qualifying adjective coward, because he didn't look into Jesse's eyes when he pulled the trigger. He may well have been a coward, but that's beside the point. His murder of Jesse James was a gang-style hit. Ford wanted the reward money, plain and simple, and he killed the one man who stood in his way. Most of Jesse James' victims, too, held no weapon and posed no threat to their murderer. John Sheets was killed as he was filling out a bank slip. Jesse shot the Northfield bank clerk Joseph Hayward in the side of the head. If such actions can be called those of a coward, Jesse James and Robert Ford were not that different. Nothing more than a criminal. Ford's betrayal was the perfect element in the making of the Jesse James myth. Despite the Robin Hood comparison, no evidence exists that he ever gave his money to the poor. His first heists fit perfectly into the mold of Robin Hood, however. In the traditional folklore approach of portraying good and evil in simplistic, black and white terms, the English outlaw was the ultimate force of good fighting against the utterly bad Sheriff of Nottingham. During the morality play of Reconstruction, the Union was the definition of bad, and Jesse James, a powerful symbol who fought the faceless institutions of an evil empire, was the manifestation of good. Problem is, real people work for institutions such as banks, and Jesse James' legend wasn't helped by the men he shot point blank. Many of the people who Jesse James killed had courageously refused to give the outlaw what he wanted, even though they knew their lives were in danger. They were, in many cases, Ordinary citizens who didn't have much to lose by emptying a safe, yet nevertheless resisted Jesse James out of strong convictions of what is right and wrong, out of contempt for someone who flouts the law, or out of down-home personal feistiness. If a morality play must be made from the story of Jesse James, it is his victims who are the heroes. It is true that sympathy for Jesse James and his gang ran throughout the region, but the extent of it has been exaggerated, as have the reasons for it. As in the present day, police in the 19th century relied heavily on witnesses and informants to catch their man. Without first-hand information, an investigation would usually hit a dead end. Jesse James well understood the critical importance of the cooperation of those who could identify him. No doubt, many people who might have stepped forward in the beginning of his career refused to do so because of Jesse's reputation as a courageous opposer of Reconstruction. It's probable, however, that many, if not most, remained silent because they understood the violent, vengeful nature of the man who had run with Bloody Bill. In his masterful biography of the outlaw, T.J. Stiles goes so far as to introduce the concept of terrorism to the Jesse James story. Terrorist. The term hardly fits with the traditional image of as a Wild West outlaw yippin' and yellin' and shooting it out with the county sheriff. But he saw himself as a Southerner, a Confederate, a vindicator of the rebel cause, and so he must be seen in the context of Southern outlaws, particularly the Klan and other highly political paramilitary forces. He cannot be confused with the Red Brigades, the Tamil Tigers, Osama bin Laden, or other groups that now shape our image of terrorism. But he was a political partisan in a hotly partisan era, and he eagerly offered himself up as a polarizing symbol of the Confederate project for post-war Missouri. If Osama bin Laden's purpose on September 11, 2001 was, as many political commentators claim, to spark a worldwide uprising of Muslims against Western ways, a parallel view of Jesse James, whose goal was to get the South to rise again, is at least arguable. What is more than just arguable is the view of the James Gang as a smaller, less effective version of Cosa Nostra, Hell's Angels, or MS-13. They take money where they can get it and use it to fund their next crime. Reporters in the days of modern criminal enterprises would never get away with such aggrandizing, openly supportive screeds in the style of John Newman Edwards. But that's not to say a certain gangland mythos doesn't exist. Outlaw biker gangs are often depicted in film and literature as freedom-loving good old boys who will only hurt you if you're dumb enough to stand in the way of their road warrior lifestyle. In reality, they rob and kill with the best of them. And the Italian mafia has long been viewed by many as a renegade agency against mainstream corruption. Mario Puzo's The Godfather series of books, along with the subsequent movies, surely attests to this, as did the daily public show of support outside the New York City courthouse every day that Gambino crime boss John Gotti stood trial for racketeering when, in reality, if any one of those supporters were to be in the wrong place at the wrong time or possess something of value, he or she would experience the same fate as the victims of Jesse James. Chapter 10: The Ep Gang. Lawmen or Lawless? Sayok Corral, and the same picture pops into the minds of millions of people. It's a cold, blustery day in the high desert town of Tombstone, Arizona. Three tall, broad-shouldered men whose long frock coats do not hide their holstered 6 guns slowly walk down the dusty street. With them is a skinny man with a shotgun. Waiting for them are 4 grubby men in cowboy outfits. They, too, have holstered 6 guns. The head of the frock-coated crew, U.S. Marshal Wyatt Epp, leading his brothers, Virgil and Morgan, and their friend, Doc Holliday, tells the cowboys to throw up their hands. Instead, the cowboys draw their guns, and both sides begin shooting. When the smoke clears, the evil Clanton McLaury gang, which had been terrorizing Tombstone, is kaput, and the lawmen led by Wyatt Epp have established law and order. In reality, Wyatt Epp was wearing a Mackinaw instead of a frock coat, and he carried his revolver in a coat pocket instead of a holster. The truth is that the shootout at the OK Corral was the climax of a feud between 2 crooked factions, and the victors fled from Arizona after they'd committed murder. Wyatt Epp and his gang. Wyatt Epp was once a city policeman in Wichita, Kansas, from April 1875, until he was fired for disturbing the peace a year later. Later, he became number 2 man in the 4-man police force of Dodge City, Kansas. At the time of the gunfight at the OK Corral, he was merely a citizen deputized temporarily by history's greatest lies. Wyatt Barry Stapp Epp posed for this 1883 photo when he was the number 2 man on 4-man police force of Dodge City, Kansas. Epp, a gambler and con man, found it helpful to have a law enforcement badge. His attempt to become a sheriff in Arizona led to one of the American West's most myth lawmen. Wyatt Epp and his friends wiped out the Clanton McLaury gang of cattle rustlers who had been terrorizing the town of Tombstone, Arizona, in 1881. Reality: at least 2 of the Epp gang, Wyatt Epp and Doc Holliday, were crooks themselves. The 2 Clantons were but a tiny part of the rustler community of Cochise County, and the two McClorys were merely Clanton neighbors. The shootout was the climax of a feud between two crooked factions. His brother Virgil, Tombstone city marshal, and the nominal leader of his group. Wyatt claimed to have been appointed a deputy U.S. Marshal after the fight, but the U.S. Marshal Service has no record of such an appointment. Wyatt did not specialize in law enforcement. He had been a buffalo hunter and was always a professional gambler. He was also a con man. In 1879, he was run out of Mobeetie, Texas, for selling gold bricks. Allie App, Virgil's wife, once raged to Mattie Blaylock, Wyatt's common-law wife, about that sneaking, con-man husband of yours when Doc Holliday's paramour, Big Nose Kate Elder, accidentally opened a closet door. Paula Mitchell Marks, In and Die in the West, quotes Allie's description of what happened. Out of the closet came a big suitcase, spewing out on the floor. Wigs and beards made of unraveled rope and sewn on black cloth masks, some false mustaches, a church deacon's black frock coat, a checkered suit like drummers wear, a little bamboo cane. Lots of things like that. Wyatt's disguises, Big Nose Kate said. She explained that Doc had let Wyatt keep them in her house, but she demanded that he move them. She told Allie that Wyatt would soon have that stupid Verge under his thumb like Morgan. Early in his career, Wyatt was a horse thief in the Cherokee Nation. He was arrested and indicted but jumped bail and fled the Indian Territory. When the big cattle herds bypassed Dodge City for rail terminals farther west, Wyatt Epp moved in 1879 to another boomtown, Tombstone, Arizona, where silver mining attracted besides miners card sharks, prostitutes, merchants, and thieves. Wyatt, 31, was joined by his brothers, Jim, 38, 174 Virgil, 36, and Morgan, 28. Jim, a wounded Civil War veteran, took no part in any of the gunfights. Wyatt expected to make money not by digging silver but by gambling and staking out mining claims and selling them. He also hoped to be appointed sheriff when Cochise County, which includes Tombstone, was created. He became a deputy sheriff in Pima County, but later resigned and was replaced by Johnny Behan. The reason for his resignation has never been explained. It may have been because Pima County Sheriff Charlie Chabelle was a Democrat, and being associated with him might hurt Wyatt's chances for sheriff when Cochise County was created. Sheriffs in newly created Arizona counties were appointed by the territorial governor, Republican John C. Fremont. The sheriff collected taxes as well as enforcing the law, and he was allowed to keep 10% of what he collected. In Cochise County, the job would bring in about $40,000 a year, a fortune in the 1880s. But instead of Epp, Fremont appointed Democrat John Behan, possibly because the majority of voters in the new county were Democrats. Among other things, Wyatt coveted Behan's mistress, Josie Marcus, sometimes called Sadie Marcus. She was an actress and an heiress to a San Francisco department store fortune. She soon left the dull Behan for the dashing gambler. Wyatt happily squired the pretty actress around while he forbade his common-law wife, Mattie, from going downtown or associating with the townspeople. Wyatt obtained a quarter interest in the Faro A card and board gambling game franchise at the Long Branch Saloon. Wyatt had already established a reputation as a tough gunman, through his tall tales of how he tamed the Kansas cowtowns and his demonstrated expertise with a revolver. It seems he got his share of the franchise because he could provide protection for his associates. He also got a job with Wells Fargo. Often described as a stagecoach guard, it was more of a company detective, someone to investigate robberies and run down the robbers. The other Epp brothers found jobs in Tombstone. Jim became a faro dealer, and Morgan went to work for Wells Fargo. Virgil became a policeman in Tombstone, reporting to City Marshal Fred White. Being a police officer was important to Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan. A lawman could carry a gun openly, and if you were in law enforcement, there were numerous ways to intimidate opponents. That's another reason why Wyatt yearned to be sheriff and Virgil to be city marshal. Morgan, too, became a city policeman. Doc Holliday. Soon after the Epps settled in Tombstone, they were joined by an old friend, John Henry Doc Holliday. Holliday was different from the Epps and their other friends. He was not a poorly educated, rough-hewn frontiersman, but a highly educated, Southern gentleman from Georgia. He had graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia, but he learned that he had tuberculosis, a disease that killed his mother when he was 15. A doctor advised him to move to a drier climate. Holliday moved west, where he practiced dentistry. He learned, however, that he could make more money pulling hidden aces than pulling teeth, so he abandoned dentistry. Gambling in the Wild West was a dangerous profession. Players who felt they had been cheated seldom complained to authorities, although Doc was once arrested on a charge of unequal gambling. Instead of the law, they resorted to fists, knives, or guns. Wasted by TB, Holiday would have been beaten in a fist fight by the average 15-year-old boy, according to his friend and EP gang member Bat Masterson. So he usually carried 2 revolvers, one in a shoulder holster and one in a hip holster. As additional insurance, he also carried a long knife under his coat tails. Doc Holliday was afraid of nothing on earth, Masterson said. And quite unlike the cool and calculating Wyatt Epp, he had a hot temper. TB may have had something to do with Holliday's daring. He often said he'd rather die from a bullet or a knife than consumption, as the disease was then called. He was the nerviest, speediest, deadliest man with a 6-gun I ever saw, said Wyatt Epp. His draw was phenomenally fast, but there was nothing phenomenal about his accuracy. He missed many opponents and hit others in places like a hand or foot, even at point-blank range. Many of the shootings took place when Doc was drunk. Nevertheless, he managed to fill a number of graves. He was utterly unpredictable and the most feared member of the EP gang. But this smooth-talking multiple murderer John Henry Holiday, known as Doc, was a dentist but was more famous for pulling a gun than pulling teeth. He was dying from tuberculosis, but said he'd prefer to die in a gun or knife fight. Hot-tempered and homicidal, he killed at least 8 men and wounded many more. But in the end, tuberculosis, not a bullet or a blade, brought him down. Doc Holliday, C.1882, American photographer, was also the author of many affectionate not romantic and philosophic letters to his cousin, Melanie Holliday, a Catholic nun. Melanie Holliday, author Margaret Mitchell said, was the inspiration for the saintly Melanie Wilkes in Gone with the Wind. The cowboys, many of the ranchers in the county, sold cattle they hadn't raised. The herds came from Mexico, and they were supplied by a large and active rustler community, known locally as the Cowboys. The rustlers did not constitute a gang. They were a loosely organized group who tended to follow a couple of proficient gunfighters named Curly Bill Brocious and John Ringo. One of the groups within the rustler community was the Clanton brothers, who followed their family patriarch, Newman Old Man Clanton. After Old Man was killed by Mexican soldiers while driving a herd of stolen Mexican cattle, the Clantons continued in the family business. The McLaury brothers, friends of the Clantons, were customers of the rustlers, rather than rustlers themselves, as were most of the ranchers in Cochise County. One of them explained that giving the rustlers a cold shoulder was a good way to get your cattle stolen. Nevertheless, to the Epps, being friendly with the Clantons made you as bad as them. Rustling cattle was not the cowboys' biggest sin in the eyes of Tombstone's residents. Few of the citizens raised cattle, and anyway, the cows mostly came from Mexico. The Civil War was still a vivid memory in the 1880s, and most of the Tombstone citizens came from Union Territory and belonged to the Republican Party. Most of the cowboys were Southerners and Democrats. The two groups just didn't like each other. The Law and Order League, the Epps, who were strong Union men, quickly became popular with the citizens of Tombstone. The fact that Doc Holliday's father had been a Confederate major didn't seem to detract from the Epp gang's popularity. Wyatt especially made powerful friends, such as John P. Clum, editor of the Tombstone Epitaph, who became mayor of Tombstone. Clum backed the Epp brothers when they organized what they called the Law and Order League, a political party. Wyatt planned to run for sheriff at the next election. In addition to cattle rustling, there were stagecoach robberies. The Law and Order people claimed that the cowboys were responsible. The cowboys blamed other citizens of Tombstone. The evidence indicates that both groups were right. 2 stage robbers, Frank Stillwell and Pete Spencer, arrested who was who at the OK Corral. Few retellings of the OK Corral tale hint at how complicated the situation was. Parables about good versus evil are seldom complicated. Consequently, the traditional cast of characters is limited to the Epp brothers and Doc Holliday on one side and the Clanton and McLaury brothers on the other, with Johnny Bean as a kind of evil presence lurking in the background. The cast of major characters was more numerous, though. It included the following: 4 stage robbery about this time, were also Tombstone businessmen. They were tracked down and arrested by 2 posses, one led by Johnny Bean and composed of cowboy sympathizers, the other organized by Virgil and Wyatt Epp. The Epps and the cowboys were not always deadly enemies. They could cooperate when each side saw an advantage. One such instance made an Epp a top law enforcer. Virgil became city marshal of Tombstone in 1880. Tombstone City Marshal Fred White was disarming Curly Bill Brocious. The young cowboy leader was celebrating something or other by shooting his Colt .45 in a city street. White demanded Curly Bill's gun. The cowboy handed it over, but the gun went off, fatally wounding White. Virgil Epp claimed he had grabbed Brocious from behind just as he was handing over the gun, and the gun accidentally fired. The best explanation is that the rustler used a trick known ever after as the curly bill spin. The gunman hands the officer his revolver but with his trigger finger in the trigger guard. As the officer reaches for the gunman with a quick flip of his wrist reverses the muzzle's direction and fires. Fred White agreed that the shooting was accidental, but he was in severe shock, and Curly Bill performed his trick so fast White couldn't really see what happened. The outcome was advantageous to both Brocious and Epp. Curly Bill got rid of an annoying lawman, and Virgil replaced the missing marshal until an election could be held. Virgil expected to win easily, but he was defeated by Ben Sippy in a special election and then in the regular municipal election in January 1881. But 6 months later, Sippy took a leave of absence and disappeared. He never returned to Tombstone. Virgil again became city marshal, but relations between the Epps and the Cowboys had taken a strange turn well before that. The fatal stage robbery on March 15, 1881, an attempt was made to hold up the stagecoach traveling from Tombstone to Benson, Arizona, shortly after it left Tombstone. The robbery was botched. The driver and a passenger were killed, but the coach got away. Sheriff Johnny Behan organized a posse, including his deputy, Billy Breckenridge, Wyatt Epp, Virgil Epp, Morgan Epp, Doc Holliday, Wells Fargo Special Agent Marshall Williams, and Bat Masterson, who was visiting his friend Wyatt. The fact that the posse included the Epp gang and their friends, like Masterson and Williams, shows that Behan had no great animosity toward Wyatt Epp, at least not enough to preclude him from enlisting first-class fighting men. The posse didn't catch the robbers, but they found a man named Luther King, who confessed that he had held the bandits' horses. King didn't want to talk until his captors told him that a woman who was a friend of Doc Holliday had been killed. King, like many others, was absolutely terrified of the scrawny little dentist. He identified the hold-up men as Harry Head and Jim Crane, a couple of cowboys not well known in Tombstone, and Billy Leonard, a former watchmaker from New York, who was a close personal friend of Doc Holliday. Leonard, like Holliday, had a good education, and the two had been close ever since Doc ran a saloon in Las Vegas, New Mexico. There was a rumor that Doc himself was one of the robbers. A telegraph worker said he and a companion were stringing wires when they heard a shot and saw Doc Holliday racing for Tombstone and away from the shots. It has been pointed out that King did not identify Holliday as one of the robbers. But with the hot-headed and homicidal Holliday on the posse, could he be expected to? There was a rumor that Doc himself was one of the robbers. A telegraph worker said he and a companion were stringing wires when they heard a shot and saw Doc Holliday racing for Tombstone and away from the shots. There were other rumors. One was that Marshall Williams, who was later fired from Wells Fargo after it was proved that he had been stealing from the company for years, had tipped off Wyatt and Morgan Epp that the stage was carrying $20,000 worth of silver. At any rate, many in Tombstone and Cochise County said the hunters were hunting themselves. Behan and Breckenridge brought King back to Tombstone, left him in the care of Undersheriff Harry Woods. Minutes later, King walked out of the unlocked rear door of the jail and disappeared. Doc's on-again off-again lover, Big Nose Kate, added to the rumors. After one of her spats with Holliday, Kate got drunk and told Johnny Behan that Doc had helped rob the stage and committed the two murders. Behan arrested Holliday, but when Kate sobered up, she recanted her statement, and Justice Wells Spicer ordered the charges dropped. Wyatt's publicity proposal, none of this activity distracted Wyatt Epp from his main goal, the sheriff's badge. He decided that the stagecoach robbery offered an opportunity in his campaign for sheriff. He approached Ike Clanton and Frank McLaury, who either knew Leonard, Head, and Crane or knew how to reach them. I told them I wanted the glory of capturing Leonard, Head, and Crane, and if I could do it, it would help me make the race for sheriff at the next election, Wyatt said. I told them that if they would put me on the track of Leonard, Head, and Crane and tell me where those men were hid, I would give them all the reward and would never let anyone know where I got the information. Ike corroborated the story sort of. He said Wyatt offered, in addition to the reward money, $6,000 from his own pocket. And, Ike added, Wyatt said he would have to kill them or else have to leave the country. He said he and his brother, Morg, had piped off to Doc Holliday and Billy Leonard the money that was going off on the stage, and he said he could not afford to capture them. Wyatt said Ike responded favorably to the offer, saying he wanted to get Billy Leonard out of the way, because Leonard owned some land Ike was trying to claim. Circumstances made Wyatt's scheme moot. Leonard and Head got themselves killed a short time later. Jim Crane got a gang together and killed the killers. Then Crane went traveling with Old Man Clanton and his stolen Mexican steers. Mexican troops stole across the border and hit Clanton's party where they were camped. Crane, like Old Man Clanton, died. Ike Clanton, one of 3 brothers who were cattle rustlers, survived the gunfight at the OK Corral. His brother Billy didn't. Ike was involved in a plot to further Wyatt Earp's campaign to become sheriff of Cochise County, but circumstances foiled it, and a feud developed between Ike's friends and Wyatt's. Ike Clanton, Arizona Historical Society, but that didn't stop Wyatt. He proposed a new scheme to Clanton. Clanton, his brothers, and their friends would pretend to hold up a stage, then the Earp brothers and Holiday would appear and drive them off. Nobody would be hurt, and Wyatt would get good publicity for his campaign for sheriff. Ike Clanton was not a man who would make a major scientific breakthrough or write a classic novel, but he wasn't that dumb. He knew that in Wyatt's case there could be no stage robber like a dead stage robber. He rejected the proposal, and tension between the Clantons and McLaurys and the Earp gang increased tremendously. The Law and Order League in Tombstone began talking about forming a vigilance committee to rid Cochise County of the cowboys. On the other side, Marshall Williams, the Wells Fargo agent, had gotten drunk and said enough to Ike Clanton to make him think that Wyatt Earp had talked about his deal with Clanton. Ike was furious and terrified that his rustler friends would learn that he had agreed to double-cross some of them. The road to the OK Corral on October 25, 1881, Tom McLaury planned to come into Tombstone to complete a cattle sale to a local butcher. Ike Clanton decided to accompany him, with the main purpose of getting drunk. While 18-year-old Tom McLaury was conducting family business, Ike Clanton checked his guns as the law required, had a few drinks, and entered a lunchroom at around midnight. Doc Holliday and Wyatt and Morgan Earp were also in the lunchroom. The Clanton and Earp accounts differ, but both agree that Holliday and Clanton had words concerning the robbery of the Benson stagecoach. Holliday and Morgan Earp, with their hands under their coats, told Clanton to go and get his gun. Virgil Earp showed up with his deputy, Jim Flynn. Virgil told Morgan and Doc to leave Ike alone, adding, according to Ike, while Jim is here. According to Wyatt Earp, Ike Clanton left, threatening Holliday and all 3 Earps. "You must not think I won't be after you all in the morning," Wyatt quoted Ike. If Ike said that, he was not only drunk but insane. He was alone and no gunfighter, but all 3 Earps were highly proficient, and Holliday was perhaps the most dangerous man in Arizona. About half an hour later, Ike got into a poker game. At the same table were Tom McLaury, Johnny Bean, and Virgil Earp. The next morning, he retrieved his revolver and rifle and staggered around Tombstone muttering threats against the Earp brothers and Holliday. Virgil and Morgan Earp sneaked up behind him, bashed him on the head, took his guns, and dragged him off to the courtroom, where the judge fined him $25 and confiscated the guns. The OK Corral, scene of the legendary gunfight between the Earp gang and the Clantons and McLaurys. The shootout was the climax of a feud between 2 crooked factions, not a victory for law and order, in spite of the many reenactments in the movies and on television. OK Corral, Arizona Historical Society. A little later, Wyatt encountered teenage Tom McLaury. "Are you healed or not?" Earp asked the boy. McLaury said he had no gun. Earp slapped him with his left hand and hit him on the head with his gun. The kid fell down and struggled to his feet. Wyatt pistol-whipped him again. A witness recalled that McLaury protested that he had never done anything against him and was a friend of his, but Wyatt hit Tom McLaury 4 or 5 times with the revolver. Around 2 p.m., Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury rode into Tombstone. They knew Ike would be drunk and expected that Tom would have trouble getting him into the wagon. The citizens of Tombstone expected a lot more trouble than that. Shootout at the OK Corral. One citizen, B.U.E. Fallahy, later testified, "I heard some stranger ask Ike Clanton what was the trouble. He said there would be no trouble. Then saw the marshal and the sheriff talking. The sheriff says, 'What's the trouble?' The marshal says, 'Those men have been making threats. I will not arrest them but will kill them on sight.' Bean found the cowboys lined up on Fremont Street behind the OK Corral. Ike Clanton and Tom McLaury said they had no guns. Bean searched them to make sure. Billy Clanton and Frank McLaury said they were just about to leave. In a minute they'd take both their guns and themselves out of Tombstone. Bean looked up the street and saw the Earp gang approaching. For some reason, Virgil Earp had given Doc Holliday his shotgun. It was a weapon not likely to be mistaken for a hunting arm. Its 10-gauge barrels were sawed off to about 14 inches, and its stock was sawed off just behind the pistol grip. Holliday carried it in his hand under his long gray overcoat. Bean ran up to the Earp gang and asked for time to disarm the 2 armed cowboys. They brushed by him as if he weren't there. It should be noted that the Earps and Holliday were not facing all the rustlers in Cochise County, only 2 of them and 2 of their neighbors. And of the 4, only 2 were armed. Tom McClory threw open his coat to show he wasn't armed, and Doc Holliday blasted him with a barrel full of buckshot, killing him instantly. Martha King was shopping at the butcher shop as the Tombstone gunman marched down Fremont Street. She saw Holliday's coat blow open, revealing the shotgun. "I heard this man on the outside," she said. Looked at Holliday, and I heard him say, "Let them have it." And Doc Holliday said, "All right." Tom McClory threw open his coat to show he wasn't armed, and Doc Holliday blasted him with a barrel full of buckshot, killing him instantly. Morgan Epp, the man on the outside, fired at almost the same time and hit Billy Clanton. Ike Clanton ran for dear life and hid in a photographer's studio. Doc Holliday, perhaps shaken by the recoil of his hand cannon, missed him. Wyatt Epp shot Frank McClory. He said he drew his gun after McClory but beat the drop, as they said in those days. What he testified to is impossible. In the 1930s, Ed McGivern, a trick shooter and a pioneer in the electrical timing of shooting stunts, proved that to beat a man to the draw who started first, you would have to be twice as fast as him. Nobody is twice as fast as an experienced gunman, and Frank McClory was, according to Wyatt Epp, a good shot and a dangerous man. Although hit, Frank McClory was still standing. He tried unsuccessfully to get his rifle from the saddle scabbard on his horse, then drew his revolver and gave Doc Holliday a slight wound. Morgan Epp fired again, hitting Frank McClory in the head. Billy Clanton, down but not out, fired from the ground and hit Morgan in the shoulder and Virgil in the leg. Both wounded Epp brothers shot Billy Clanton again. A bystander ran up to him, and Billy's last words were a request for more cartridges. Denouement. The trial that followed the shootings was merely a preliminary hearing to decide if the case should go to a grand jury, and even that was a farce. The judge was Will Spicer, a close friend of Wyatt Epp. Virgil and Morgan Epp, being seriously wounded, were excused from testifying. Wyatt Epp's testimony consisted of reading a written statement, and no one was allowed to cross-examine him. Spicer ignored the testimony of all disinterested witnesses. Although the defense could produce no one to say the cowboys fired first, Spicer decided that the Epp gang was doing its duty as officers of the law. Wyatt Epp then gathered a posse of hard cases from all over the Southwest and shot up the town of Charleston where the rustlers met to drink, but they didn't get any rustlers. Somebody got Virgil Epp, though. They ambushed him and shot him, leaving him crippled for life. A little later, someone shot Morgan Epp in the back as he was making a pull shot. A second bullet just missed Wyatt. Virgil took Morgan's body to their parents in California, and Wyatt took his posse out to hunt for the killers. They apparently lured Frank Stillwell, who, they suspected, killed Morgan, to a train station in Tucson and riddled him with bullets before he could draw his gun. Unfortunately for the Epps, Tucson was in Pima County. The sheriff of Pima swore out a warrant charging Wyatt Epp, Warren Epp, Wyatt's youngest brother, who had just joined him, Doc Holliday, and Sherman McMasters, a stage robber friend of Wyatt's, with murder. The Epps and their friends managed to elude posses from Pima and Cochise counties while hunting others on their blacklist. Wyatt's steel vest was one of the reasons Doc Holliday eventually broke up with him. Doc said he was tired of taking risks Wyatt did not take because of his bulletproof undershirt. They killed a Mexican suspected, with little reason, of being an accomplice in the murder of Morgan, and they claimed to have had a fight with 9 cowboys during which Wyatt killed Curly Bill Brocious. Most people at the time did not believe the last claim, because Curly Bill's body was never found and the Epps were not known for burying their victims. One of the cowboys involved in the fight said he had a clear shot at Wyatt but did not kill him because of Wyatt's steel vest. Wyatt's steel vest was one of the reasons Doc Holliday eventually broke up with him. Doc said he was tired of taking risks Wyatt did not take because of his bulletproof undershirt. Wyatt and company eventually surfaced in Colorado, where Bat Masterson had powerful connections, and Colorado rejected an extradition request by Arizona. Memories of the murders gradually faded. Wyatt married Josie Marcus and abandoned Mattie Blaylock, who became a prostitute and then committed suicide. Wyatt outlived all his contemporaries. Doc Holliday, in spite of everything, died of tuberculosis. Wyatt found an author, Stuart Lake, who listened to all his lies and wrote a book, Wyatt Epp, Frontier Marshal, which turned the old thug into the Sir Galahad of the frontier. End of Chapter 5. Lies from the American Wild West. Should you want to continue to Chapter 6, Lies from Just Yesterday, please proceed to the next video. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this book. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you.